It's not been easy. We have kept Gail's bakeries trading, or at least some of them, throughout the entire crisis. And there was a low point when we thought we were going to have to shut all our branches because we were struggling to get staff to turn up. And some of them were frightened. Some of them perhaps felt they were enjoying sitting at home on 80% of their salary and not having to pay the commuting costs and so forth. And why work? I'm very pleased to say that we have almost all our branches up and running again now, because we've converted them to takeaway business only. And in fact, I'm very excited to say that we're opening a new branch, a brand new one, on Friday in Windsor. And I think symbolically, this is, for us, morale-wise, really important. It's saying, come on, onwards. We are not letting this pandemic defeat us. I can't pretend it has been easy. And I think some staff will not come back. I saw an email from one staff member today saying that they're struggling with accessing public transport. They are fearful. What is a shame is that, roughly speaking, 250 people in total across England have died if they haven't had any serious illness, pre-existing condition, under the age of 60. And it's something like only about 30 under the age of 40 with no pre-existing condition who've died tragically during this crisis. So the real risks from healthy staff of working age are very low indeed. But unfortunately, government's Project Fear has been so effective scaring the country that people have struggled to get the risks in proportion. And we have to re-educate people, and our staff and teams in particular, that they seriously are not in danger. And that's not easy. And perhaps some will, as I say, never come back. And that's a shame because, generally we've spent a great deal of time recruiting, training good people. But we have to keep trading in order to have any staff at all. Otherwise, we're out of business. Well, apart from reminding them that ultimately furlough doesn't last forever, so that if they give up work altogether, then they're going to be unemployed. We remind them that, being part of an organisation that cherishes them and wants to see them succeed, that we do offer progression in the organisation, that loyal and productive members of staff have escalating pay rates, they get other benefits. And, I think the majority of people do actually want to be useful and work and productive and contribute and don't want to sit at home. An awful lot of people, I suspect, in week 10 have got very bored indeed. And there comes a time at which you say, just being idle, what use is that? So I hope that is the mentality across the whole of the British Isles, that people actually want to get out and, be working, because ultimately our entire country's standard of living is going to plummet if too many people are unemployed and, watching Netflix on the sofa all day. It just doesn't work for our if we want to even feed ourselves. I think it depends a great deal on which business and how optimistic one is feeling. I've talked to quite a few operators who think they will be doing 100% business by the end of the calendar year, i.e. same as they were, so to speak, previous January. So January 20 would compare to January 21. I hope that's not over-optimistic. It may be. I do think the point we were referring to earlier is consumer fear will obviously be a major factor. And obviously another major factor is, will social distancing rules still be in place in 6 months' time, or will they have been lifted by then? What one sincerely hopes is that the illnesses and, God forbid, deaths from the virus have more or less completely disappeared by then. There's been no second wave, and people have taken up, so to speak, old habits in terms of socializing. What we all pray for as members of the hospitality industry is that being with people, meeting friends, celebrating, enjoying life in company, eating and drinking food, which humans have been doing for hundreds, probably thousands of years as a form of existence, and very central, I think, to our core as living creatures. We hope that they get back to those habits, and clearly the economic environment as a whole is going to be worse, but we think that I believe that going out and enjoying food and drink away from home is a confirmed choice. And although it is a discretionary spend, it's a priority for the customer. And, you know, we have to try extra hard to bring them back, to make them feel welcome, to give them a great time, to remind them of what they've been missing, you know, under lockdown, and that, you know, we all need to appreciate the hospitality industry and what it can give society. And I don't think it will be easy. So I am concerned that some businesses will take, you know, more than 6 months, perhaps 12 months to reach sustainable levels of profits, even if all the social distancing is done for. And somehow or other, we all have to adjust our business models to cope in the meantime with these lower but hopefully increasing levels of business, because clearly, you know, we're out of business if we have a break even that means we have to do, I don't know, 85 or 90% of previous levels of trade, because it may take a while to get to that level. And we need to adjust our cost base as far as we conceivably can to cope with, you know, a degree of austerity in our terms in the level of meals we serve and drinks we serve. Not many businesses think they'll be up to 100% of what they were doing previously by September. I think some, where they're fearful that social distancing will be in place for, you know, many months, think they will be at 100% of old levels by the year end. I suspect they're thinking that's 12 months away at least, or maybe even 18 months away. I mean, I think places, nightclubs and things, places where it's by nature designed to be busy and crowded, would probably feel the same. Although what I would say, and I think is a very distinct difference, is if you are appealing to the sub 40, you know, Generation Z and millennials, I think they're aware that they are dramatically less at risk from coronavirus than older generations. So if you're appealing to a younger demographic, then they are likely to resume old habits quicker. Whereas if you have quite a bias towards a 60+ customer base, which some more upmarket dining venues and theatre and certain forms of entertainment do, for example, then could be slower, because certainly amongst all my acquaintances, the ones generally who are the most worried rationally are older people who are clearly more at risk, and so you can't blame them for being more fearful. There is a very detailed website, nhs.net, I think it is, COVID-19 deaths, and I can supply you with the proper domain name afterwards, which gives really exhaustive, you know, it's the official, I think it links to ONS, it's the official website, so it gives it all there, chapter and verse. Well, obviously, we'd all love to see retail rates, if not scrapped, reduced significantly. They are disproportionate relative to other countries, much higher than virtually any other country. and they're a major burden for tenants. And so, any relief in that area long term is obviously a good thing. Unfortunately, they do raise, I think, about £25 billion a year. That is across all classes of commercial premises, business rates, and so therefore, it's a very lucrative tax. And I think long term the government will be loath to surrender it. It might be that, for example, certain classes of retailer, maybe hospitality or maybe business of a certain size, may get more reductions. I think the system has become very complex. I think clearly as rents come down, which they will in the future, there's no question of that, so the rates must fall in line. But since they reformed the rates last, it's become vastly more difficult to get rebates, and the whole complexity of rates, calculation of rebates and so forth is now a massive industry in its own right, and that extra administrative burden is also unhelpful. So I do think this is the best ever moment for wholesale reform of business rates, because I think they're a mess, and I think they are disproportionate, and Britain's high streets, both retailers and hospitality, are dying, and business rates is one of the main causes. So I think as soon as we finish the lockdown, then the next task for people like UK Hospitality and others lobbying government is to focus on wholesale reform of business rates, and that means big reductions long term permanently. I don't know, because I think the property industry are lobbying ferociously, and they're well connected. They have been throughout history. They are, after all, landlords and the House of Lords, and that's no coincidence. And I'm fearful that once things have returned to a degree of normality in terms of us being allowed to trade again, the government might cut us adrift. Rational landlords will realise that to a large degree, if they evict their tenants, they're going to take a very long time to find a new tenant. The new tenant is likely to be only willing to pay a lower rent. They're going to have to give them a long rent free and maybe a contribution to fit out. And in the meantime, the landlord's going to have to pay the business rates when they return. So it's a very dumb thing for a landlord unilaterally to just evict tenants, because there is no question that virtually all retail leases are now higher than any new leases to be signed going into the future. Because if, as the worst fears come to be realised, that perhaps anywhere from 10 to 30% of the industry closes for good post this, which is feasible, then that's a vast amount of void space. So tenants are going to have the best choice of sites at better rents than they've ever had in modern history, and that will affect passing rent levels. So landlords evict tenants at their peril, because a vacant site will not do them much good. And these days with CVAs, which, for example, Pizza Express is reputed to be contemplating, mean that tenants can push through a process which allows them to pick and choose which sites to keep and which to dump. And if that's what landlords force them into doing, because there's no compromise and no concessions and no mutuality in the changed circumstances that tenants find themselves, then long term the landlords will be the worse off. The value of their investments will collapse with vacant sites and no rent coming in. I think we need a sophistication and a perspective from landlords, and ultimately we need to rebase rents around percentage of turnover with very low minimums, which means that the better a tenant does, obviously the better the landlord does. But it also means that in bizarre periods like this, where tenants do very low levels of turnover, for example, perhaps when we reopen, so the rent is then bearable, rising only as the revenue increases. And that, to me, is the sensible way forwards. And in all the businesses I'm involved with, we are in dialogue with all the landlords. And I would say probably by now a majority are being more reasonable, because I think they realise that this is a structural shift and we're not going back to the old upwards only, absolutely, you know, rack rental every time and send in the bailiffs if you don't pay by the quarter date. I think that sort of brutal one-sided relationship is finished, and so it should be. Well, I have my reservations about the 80% of salary, because it seems to me it's rather higher than in some other countries. And given that people can sit at home and not pay the cost of commuting and so forth, and not work and get 80% of their salary if they're paid below a certain amount, whereas some of their colleagues, for example, might be working on 100% of salary only, that felt inequitable. And, you know, in one or two businesses I was involved with where people were still working, there was some unhappiness about that. I do think, unfortunately, a certain proportion of the 8 million furloughed people have got quite comfortable, and with the fine weather have, you know, to be blunt, almost been enjoying lockdown, got out of the habit of working. And, you know, one might almost argue there's been a bit of malingering going on, which is most unfortunate. I think paid idleness is good for no one, society nor the recipients ultimately. Anyhow, that will end. I think a great many companies that have been used to paying nothing for furlough will struggle to suddenly contribute whatever it is, maybe a quarter of the cost of furlough. So, you know, if it goes down to 60% paid by the government, but the other 20% still has to be paid by the company, because they still need to receive 80%. I think an awful lot of businesses will say either they come to work or they're made redundant. And I think we will see that, I'm afraid to say, come into play soon, because with large numbers of redundancies, obviously there has to be the 45 days notice for consultation. So I fear that next month we will see some quite big redundancies announced, or certainly consultations, because I fear, you know, if, for example, the 2 million odd people in the hospitality sector as a whole, and say 10% of the industry goes out of business, you know, that alone is what, for 200,000 people, and that's just hospitality. I completely agree with the government. They must end furlough. I think in some ways, I'm in slight disagreement with some of the industry. I think perhaps they should have made the cut-off sooner, because I think it is, as I say, encouraging idleness and perhaps stretching out the agony. I would rather that companies got back to business sooner and start rebuilding, getting to sensible levels of revenue. And there is no question in my mind that a lot of people on furlough, and who knows how many, but it could be even millions, it's just delayed redundancy. And I don't think that's very good for them. They should be going out to get a job, and it's not very good for the national finances. You know, we will end up this year with at least 2 trillion of national debt, having increased it by hundreds of billions in a space of 6 months or so, in a totally unsustainable fashion. And you know, it's an enormous burden on the taxpayer, and it can't continue. So although I think it was meant well and it's been generally good for the hospitality industry, I think we all need to wean ourselves off this addictive subsidy, because it can't carry on. Well, I think one of the differences we're seeing in society at the moment is that the private sector is ultimately flexible and adaptable. And if we think of how companies have adjusted in our industry and others to cope with these extraordinary new conditions and regulations, so that pubs and many other food and drink outlets have converted themselves into takeaway only, for example, and other private sector companies from Amazon to the supermarkets have adapted and carried on seamlessly in terms of delivering. That's adaptability and flexibility. Unfortunately, government isn't quite like that. So, for example, it's something perhaps you'll talk about in a while, but I'll bring it up now. The 2-meter rule for physical or social distancing is clearly nonsense. No other country that I know has adopted it. The WHO says that 1 meter is sufficient. And yet in this country, the government have said 2 meters, so they're sticking to it. That is ludicrous inflexibility. And I worry that with things like furlough, they'll try and make it too simple. For whose benefit, I'm not sure. Of course, there should be flexibility about things like people working part-time, because it will make it much easier for businesses to adjust. And I hope that they are hearing that message from people like UK Hospitality, and that is factored into the adjustments. I accept all the legislation was brought in a ferocious hurry, and so it was always going to be imperfect. But I worry that government move a snail's pace in many respects, and often it's the wrong thing too late. Another thing that is ludicrous is the 2-week quarantine rule as regards foreign arrivals to this country, guaranteed to utterly destroy the tourism industry and ruin everyone's possibility of having a summer holiday abroad. After the horse has bolted, what on earth is the point of it? They should scrap that. It was a bad idea, and they should stop it. But unfortunately, they're the government, and they sort of, once we've made a rule, we're sticking to it. And sticking to your rules is sometimes, it seems to me, more important than actually being right. Well, I think it's mad. We're reopening at least a month after the rest of Europe and much of America. What is good is, as far as I can see, things are picking up, shall we say, in a lot of places in terms of levels of trade being done quite steadily. And yes, there are physical distancing measures in place and allowing people to feel safe, but actually people love going out to eat and drink, and they want to do it again. So I think we should get back to work. I think this is a cover-up for the sort of mistakes that Jeremy just mentioned, and I've tweeted about rather extensively, and so forth and so on. We need our civil liberties back. The sooner the better. I reckon in all my businesses we could get people back in place within a few days, and that's what I'd love, because you look at this unbelievable weather we are having, for example, this week, and Brighton Pier shut. It's an absolute tragedy. It's good and healthy to be outside and in the sunshine. The level of transmission outside is negligible according to all the research. And so I think particularly for pubs with beer gardens and restaurants with al fresco dining, it's cruel and unnecessary to keep people locked up. And again, I would say this is the rigidity of government being stubborn and bureaucratic, rather than seeing that they almost need to lead the public a bit now and say, no, you can go out, it's safe to go out. They want a complete change of message away from Project Fear, and they want a message saying, go out, have fun, live life, because being social is part of what it is to be human. And by the way, we need the business as a country, and you need to get back to work and back to school, and they need to get public transport working again properly, and we need to return to life. We've been in this horrible hibernation for too long. And if you look at virtually every other country in Europe now, schools are open. Most of them by June the 1st will have restaurants and bars open, in fact, virtually all of them. And we need to be doing like they are, rather than waiting an extra 5 weeks. For what? I don't understand.